Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Thanks for coming in. So let's get started. As you know, every week we open our show with a special guest. Today we're honored to have a former member of Knesset and retired IDF Colonel Eliezer Chita Cohen. Let's hear what he has to ask.
Shalom, Alan. Thank you for having me on your show on ILTV. As you remember, we met in your office when I was a member of Knesset. I came to seek your advice on a constitution for Israel. I then brought the Knesset Committee for Constitution and Justice and Law to Washington and Canada. There we met your colleague, Erwin Kotler, Justice Scalia, Justice Ginsburg. I believe we need a constitution in Israel to make a separation of church and state and give every Israeli the same gift that Americans have by having a constitution. What do you think, sir?
Colonel Cohen, you are a great hero of the Israeli people. Your work in the military, your work on behalf of attempting to get a constitution deserve tremendous commendation. Look, I agree with you. I think Israel would be better off with a written constitution, but I think it's going to be very difficult to get one. If a written constitution had been adopted in 1948, that would have been very possible at the beginning of the nation. But now the sides have been formed, and it's going to be very hard to get agreement between the secular Israelis and the Orthodox Israelis as to how to strike the appropriate balance between Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people and Israel being a democracy with equal rights for all without regard to religion. So I commend you for working hard to try to get a written constitution, but I'm not optimistic that in the end, Israel will be able to resolve in writing, in constitutional terms, this conflict between state, church, mosque, and synagogue. Israel is blessed, however, with an unwritten constitution, much like England. And the work of people like President Aaron Barak and others in the Supreme Court, President Dorik Beinish, to create basic laws and give them a kind of constitutional status is second best to a written constitution. Great Britain has survived for many years without a written constitution. I'm afraid Israel may have to survive, certainly in the immediate future, without a written constitution. But I support your efforts to try to get a written constitution. I will help you in any way possible. And I just wish you going from strength to strength in your heroic efforts. If Israel does get a written constitution, you will be regarded as one of its important parents.
Thanks, Professor. Now let's turn to the questions from our viewers. Violeta Kamrat hails from Poland, but she now lives in New York, and she wants to know how to bridge the generational gap when talking about the Holocaust.
Hi, Alan. My name is Violeta. Originally from Poland. Now I live in New York. I have visited Israel, and I have many close Jewish friends. Your generation, my generation, who grew up in Poland, have completely different perspective on the events that happened 70 years ago and how these events should impact our lives today. I treat my Jewish friends here in America through mutual respect, without the emotional baggage that is naturally felt by your generation. With that in mind, how should we approach one another so that you understand our perspective and we understand yours?
Thank you so much, Violeta, for sharing your perspective with me and with this audience. I'm not sure that different generations have different perspectives on the Holocaust. I think we all regard it as one of the greatest crimes committed against humanity. I think that there are different perspectives depending on where you come from. Tragically, in Poland today, there is an attempt to erase the history of Polish involvement in the Holocaust. Not all of Polish involvement. Obviously, the Polish government wants to emphasize the wonderful work that so many Polish people did to try to save Jews, people like Jan Karski, who risked their life, families that were murdered in an effort to hide Jews. But the Polish government today is trying to hide the complicity of many, many Polish, not only ordinary people, but members, high-ranking members of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust. We know that even following the end of the Holocaust, in a town called Kiltza, many Jews were murdered in cold blood as a result of incitements done by Polish leaders. And you can't rewrite history. We know from the book Neighbors by Jan Gross that barns were filled with Jews and burned to death, not by Germans, but by Poles. We know that there is a long history of Polish anti-Semitism, particularly emanating from the Polish Catholic Church. And it didn't end until, maybe it hasn't ended yet, Cardinal Glemp, who not long ago was the primate of Poland, was a virulent anti-Semite. And several of his predecessors, who were primates of the Polish Catholic Church, thrived on anti-Semitism and taught their young people from the pulpit to hate Jews and that Jews were Christ killers, and you know. So I'm not sure that we have a different generational perspective. I think all of our generations want to make sure that the Holocaust is never repeated. We also want to make sure that the moratorium on anti-Semitism, which really begins at the end of the Second World War, doesn't end as it has been ending in some parts of Eastern Europe. So I think my generation has a perspective in which we respect each other. Yes, there is emotion involved because our relatives were killed. It was our generation. I was 7 years old by the end of the Second World War and would have been among those who did not survive if I lived in Poland, where my parents and where my grandparents came from. And there, but for the grace of God, go we and many in our generation. So I think we have to share generational perspectives, but never, ever deny history. And that history is a mixed history for the people of Poland during the Shoah. Many helped save Jews, but far too many helped kill Jews.
Very interesting, Professor. Your answer very much speaks to me. I found her question to be very insightful. All right, let's turn to the United States. Lisa Gladstone votes in Florida, and she wants your take on the recent debate between the vice presidential nominees.
Hello, Mr. Dershowitz. I'm Lisa, and I vote in Florida. I watched the debate last night, and I thought Mr. Pence won by a landslide. I'm curious to know who you thought won. I am very concerned about Mr. Kane's relationship with J Street, and I'd like to know who you think will be better for Israel. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I too vote in Florida. I fully intend to vote for the Clinton-Kane ticket. I did not like Kane's performance last night. I thought he interrupted too often, and I thought he was a little too aggressive at times. I do think Pence did a much better job, but I cannot, under any circumstances, vote for a candidate who would deny a woman the right to choose abortion. I could never vote for a candidate who believes that gay people have to be subjected to psychological tests and psychological change to turn them into heterosexuals. In America, we have very difficult choices. Let's assume hypothetically for 1 second that Pence might be slightly better for Israel than Kane. And I share with you my criticism of Kane for not having gone to Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech and for his accepting support from J Street. I agree with that. But that puts people like me into a very difficult situation. On the one hand, we want the most pro-Israel candidate we can get. On the other hand, I can't bring myself to vote for a candidate who demeans women, who would punish women if they had to have an abortion. And as an American, I have to strike an appropriate balance between what's best for America, what's best for the world, what's best for Israel. My own view is that Hillary Clinton would be good for Israel. I think on Israel Trump is unpredictable. I think Pence would be very strong for Israel, but he's the vice president, not the person running for president. So for me, it's a balance that has to be struck. And what tips the balance for me are the domestic issues, where I can't possibly vote for candidates who would deny some of the most basic and fundamental rights of women, of gays, separation of church and state, and other fundamentals that make America great. I also think that in the world today, we need stability, we need predictability, and I think the Clinton ticket brings more stability and predictability to a very unstable world than the Trump ticket. I really have no idea where Trump stands on many issues, including Israel. So it sounds to me like our votes will be split and cancel each other out. But that's the way it works in a democracy.
Thanks, Professor. Now let's turn to St. Louis, Missouri, where Mark Schaefer is concerned about racial inequality in the United States.
All right, Alan, my name's Mark Schaefer. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm stressed out over the racial conflict that we're all experiencing, whether it be Colin Kaepernick and taking a knee or the police shootings. Ferguson is close to where I live. And you're a very intelligent man, and I would love for you to simplify down to 3 steps that you would take, not to solve it because it's too big an issue to solve, but to address it and start to get us in the right direction. What are the 3 steps that you would recommend that Americans come together around, the ideas we would come together around, to start to move in the right direction, to bring ourselves together?
Mark, thank you very much. Here we really do have a generational problem. My generation understands that racial relations in America have improved dramatically, perhaps more than any other area in American life. When you go back to the O.J. Simpson case or the Rodney King case, just 21 years ago, racial relations were terrible. If you want to go back to when I was a young person, we still had segregation. But the situation, even in relation to police relations with African-American young men, has gotten much, much, much better. The number of African-American young men who were killed by unjust police actions is very, very much less than it was years ago. So we're on the right track. I think organizations like Black Lives Matter are taking us on the wrong track. Of course, Black Lives Matter. I support the concept, but Black Lives Matter has basically said Black Lives matter, but Jewish lives don't matter. Black Lives Matter in its platform was prepared to call only one country in the world genocidal and apartheid, and that is Israel. Black Lives Matter's platform is overtly anti-Semitic, and one does not have to have a trade-off. I can support the concept of Black Lives Matter and of improving the situation of Black men in inner cities without buying into an anti-Semitic, overtly anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel platform. So I will have nothing whatsoever to do with Black Lives Matter as an organization. I will not contribute a penny to them. I will stand in strong opposition to their platform until and unless they change their leadership and they change their platform and they allow Jews who support the concept of Black Lives Matters to march hand in hand with them, as we did during the civil rights period in the 1960s. Today on college campuses, Jews are excluded from many organizations that promote civil rights and civil liberties because they have to essentially take an oath that they do not believe in Israel and think that Israel is an apartheid or genocidal state. I will not make that choice, and I will not encourage others to make that choice. We can start our own organizations to promote equality. So that's number 1 step. Start our own organizations. Don't join organizations that are bigoted and anti-Semitic and directed against Israel. Don't sacrifice your own standards. If I am not for myself, what am I? And if I am for myself alone, what am I? Understand Hillel's notion. Number 2, we have to have major reform in the criminal justice system. Far, far too many African-American people are today in prison for minor crimes. And number 3, we just have to start talking to each other. It can't be just right or wrong, one side or the other. We need to introduce nuance into the conversation. And those are three elements that are lacking. So I urge everybody to continue to support equality for all, but not at the price of giving up the truth when it comes to Israel and the Jewish people. We will never tolerate anti-Semitism, no matter what its source is. Affirmative action does not include the right to lie about Israel and the nation state of the Jewish people.
Thank you, Professor. Our final question comes from right here in Israel. Marina Naomi Smolyanov wants to take us back in history to an event that took place over 20 years ago, but still seems relevant today.
Hi, Alan. My name is Marina. I'm originally born in Ukraine, but now I live in Israel. 21 years ago this week, we had the famous trial of O.J. Simpson. I remember when I was 21 years ago then, and each one of us, I think, remember. It was much more than celebrity case. It was about the black and white rights in America. It was about the role of police in the society. And it also was about the question whether a person's rights are much more important than being guilty or innocent. So my question to you is, have we learned our lessons since? What should we learn? I'm really interested about hearing your answer. Thank you.
Marina, thank you so much for an excellent question. You bring me back in time. I remember vividly the night of the verdict because it was Erev Yom Kippur. And of course, I got a call. I was in Cambridge and I got a call from the defense team saying, please fly out to Los Angeles. We want you to be there in case we lose. You're going to be the appellate lawyer who will have to argue the appeal on behalf of O.J. Simpson. And I said, no, it was Erev Yom Kippur. I'm going to go to Kol Nidre service. And of course, the verdict came out in the middle of the day. I went to shul that night and nobody would look at me. Nobody would shake hands with me. I didn't get called up to the Torah. The only time people looked at me is when we did the Shamnu and you hit your heart for counseling evil. So I was not the most popular person in the world. I was popular for having worked on the O.J. Simpson case, but everybody hoped he would lose. But when we won, people turned that into a hatred for the defense attorneys. And we didn't win because we were so good. We won because the prosecution was so bad. There was one piece of evidence that the police had tampered with, a sock that had O.J. Simpson's blood and the blood of the victims. And we were able to prove that that blood had EDTA, which is an anticoagulant not found in abundance in the human body, but found in test tubes. We were able to prove that the blood was poured on the sock as it was lying flat because the sock had mirror images on all four sides, which would never happen if it had been worn during the crime itself. So racial elements played a role. I think the jury, which was largely African-American, were much more open to evidence about police planting evidence, and that helped bring about the verdict. Remember that both the Israeli system and the American system basically have a presumption of innocence, require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and say better 10 guilty go free than one innocent be wrongly confined. An interesting story, about a year later, when Benjamin Netanyahu was elected prime minister for the first time, he invited me and my wife and daughter to his office on a Friday afternoon, and we schmoozed a little bit, and then he took me into his private area and said, Alan, I have a question I want to ask you. I thought it would be about, Israel's security. He said, did OJ do it? And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons? And he said, well, Alan, I can't tell you that. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I can't tell you that. That's part of lawyer-client privilege. And we laughed and had a good chuckle about it. But the role of a criminal defense lawyer is to do whatever he or she can, consistent with legal ethics. The Torah makes it very difficult to convict al pi shnayim edim on the basis of two witnesses. Shall you sentence somebody to death? And the O.J. Simpson case initially was a death penalty case. And the evidence just wasn't compelling enough. And then, of course, the prosecution made the mistake of having Simpson try the glove on in front of the jury. They could have had him try it on outside of the presence of the jury to see whether it fit, but they didn't do that. And then it led to the famous closing argument, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. So it's a very interesting case, not the most interesting of my career. I have to tell you, I've had more interesting cases, but probably the most celebrity-driven and popular in my career. So what have we learned? We've learned the American system works and that it's still better to acquit people who you think might be guilty than to convict somebody who might be innocent. And Americans, and I suspect Israelis, care more when they believe a guilty person goes free than when they see an innocent person go to jail. And we can't accept that. We have to skew the system in favor of making sure that no innocent person is ever convicted. Acquitting the guilty is part of our system. Convicting the innocent is not part of our system.
Well, I think we're going to have to dedicate our next show to all of your stories from your cases, because I was going to ask you about your story with the Prime Minister, so we'll have to wait for next week. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much, Professor Dershowitz. I also want to thank all of our guests, especially former Knesset member Eliezer Chita Cohen. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer one of your questions, just go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.